Today's daf is daf Lamed Tes, and we're going to start on daf Lamed Ches Amid Beis, where the sugya begins. If you take a look on Lamed Ches Amid Beis, you'll see that there are three widths. So we're in the middle width, 10 lines down, and it's about 1/3 up from the end of the Amud. So again, in the middle section, 10 lines down. Tana Rabbana. Hakuspan shall ovdei kochavim. So there are various opinions exactly what kuspan is, but it seems that when they would take dates and they would make beer out of the dates, date beer, then the sediments would go down to the bottom, and they would take the sediments and soak them in hot water and make some sort of a kind of substitute for wine. Now, the problem is that when they heat up these sediments, it's in a utensil that has absorbed macholas asuros. So the Brisa makes the following distinction. Huchmu amin biyorig gedola also biyorig tana mutter. If when they took the sediments and they boiled them in water, it was a large pot, then it's osur. But if it's a small pot, then we have every reason to believe that there was no macholas asuros that was placed into the smaller pot. So the Gemara says, "Eza yorik tana." Why? How small is the pot such that you can guarantee that there was no cooking inside that pot? Rabbi Yanai, kol she'ein tzipor dror yochel likones b'tocha. So you have the small bird, which is called a tzipor dror, and its head cannot fit into the hole of this very small pot. So the Gemara asks, "V'dilma admuye v'iluye." Maybe what they did is they took this bird and they cut it up into pieces, and then they cooked it. It's a nevela inside the pot. So even though the natural head is too large to fit into this hole, but if they dismembered it, then it could fit in. Therefore, the Gemara offers another explanation of Yorik Tana. Elakol she'ein rosh tzipor dror yochel likonis b'tocha. So that what's your definition of a small pot? That the until now the Gemara thought the body of the tzipor drawer, but now the Gemara is thinking it's the head of the tzipor drawer. I jumped a little bit ahead of ourselves, and the head is not going to be chopped up. So if it's too small for the head to fit in, then the assumption is they didn't use the utensil for macholas asuros. For Tanya, the Gemara raises the objection for a brisa achas yorik dol achas yorik tana muter. Even if it was cooked in a larger pot, we still assume that no Saint Tam Lifgam is mutter, meaning that the pot hadn't been used for at least 24 hours. Lo kasha. Ha kamandi yomar no Saint Tam Lifgam osur. Ha kamandi yomar no Saint Tam mutter. So we have machlokes tanoim and amoroim about no Saint Tam Lifgam. So therefore that Machmir, who was careful about this date, sediment mixture from a Yorig Dola, he was of the opinion that no Saint Talmud Gam is awesome. And therefore, even though the pot wasn't used for Macholos Asus in the last 24 hours, and the time that penetrates into this date mixture is pogum, but nevertheless, no Saint Talmud Gam is awesome. But the other brisa that's matir even in a larger pot, that's because no Saint Talmud Gam is mutter. Omar of Sheishes, Hai Mishcha Shlika Darmoi also. So the Arameans used to boil oil. and the boiled oil is asur. And the Gemara doesn't understand why. What are we afraid of? If you're going to tell me that they mixed wine with the oil, that's not a chash. Why? Because misra sari, when the wine is added to the oil, it has a negative impact on the oil. It spoils the oil. So they would not add wine into the oil. And if you're afraid that since they took this oil and they boiled it, that makes it into bishul akum, which is the sugya of yesterday's daf. But nevertheless, nechalhu kemoshu chai. Anything that could be eaten raw and doesn't need cooking, if it was cooked by a guy, is not included under the Isur bishul akum. Imishum gi'ule ovdei kochavim. Nosin tam of gam is mutter. We're going according to the Mandiyoma that nosin tam of gam is mutter, and therefore the kli that was used by the guy for machalos asuros, and he boiled the oil in that kli, in that utensil, it wasn't used for 24 hours, and therefore the tam is pogum. So the Gemara doesn't seem to have any justification to prohibit the oils from the Armenians. Boy minemer of asi. Hi ahine shlike darmoi mai. The Arameans used to take dates and they used to boil them. Chulye loti boilach. If you're dealing with sweet ones, then for sure they're mutter. Devade shari. And why is that? Because there's no isur bishul akum in the case of sweet cooked dates, because there's no need to cook them and they're edible raw. Marire, on the other hand, if these dates are bitter and the only way that you can make them edible is by boiling them, then we have a problem. Bishul akum is loti boilach devade yasir. So where does Rav Asi, the question that was presented to Rav Asi, where does it come up? Kiti boilacha mitziyoi. You have something that could be eaten because it's not so bitter, it's a little bit sweet, but on the other hand, nobody would really want to eat it unless you cook it. That's a shita of our Rebbe, our Rebbe. Umanu, who's our Rebbe? Levi, Asa. And Levi is of the opinion that even if it's nechal, but it's only nechal raw al yidei chak, then it's subject to the Isur bishul akum. Shesisa. Okay, now what exactly is that? So I think we had this in the past. They took kernels, they parched them in an oven, and they made flour out of it. But sometimes they make it from the flour of parched lentils. Now, lentil flour is too sweet, and they add vinegar and sometimes water. Now, if vinegar would be added to the shesisa, then it would be asur, because this vinegar is really sour wine. So it's yayin shel akum. So the Gemara answers, bechite visare. If you're talking about wheat or barley, everyone agrees that it's mutter because vinegar is not added to shesisa if it's made from either chiti or siori, wheat or barley. On the other extreme, if the shesisa was made of lentils and then they mix in vinegar, is kuyamalo pligidiyasa, because the vinegar of an akum is made from wine and therefore comes under yayin nesach. Ki pligi, where is the issue that divided Rav and Avoda, Shmuel, and Levi? Is bitlofche demaya. These were shesisa that was made of lentils with water, and there's nothing osur in it, no ingredients that are made of machalos asuras. But since we said before that if the shasisa was made of lentils, they would add vinegar, and that's osur. So therefore, even in the case of the shasisa that doesn't have any vinegar in it, nevertheless, since it's still called shasisa, one might confuse one shasisa with another shasisa. And Marisar Gazrin Ha to Ha. According to Shmuel, Avoda Shmuel and Levi, we have to be machmir, because if we're going to allow you to buy shasisa and eat shasisa from the akum, you'll end up eating a different kind of shasisa, which is made with vinegar. Marsavar, but according to Rav, lo gazrina. Ika the Amri, now the Gemara has a different transmission. Bitlafchi de maya, if the shasisa is made of lentils with water, because in the case of lentils and water, what they do is they add vinegar. Keep pligi, where's the machlokas? Bechiti v'sa'aret. Mar savar gazrina ha to ha. Umar savar lo gazrina. So the machlokas here is whether or not we should make a gzera in the case of wheat and barley, because they might confuse it with lentils. Omar Rav, trei mini shesisoy shode barziloi agilodi lidavid. So David HaMelech, when he was subject to the revolution of his son Avshalom, and he left Yerushalayim as a fugitive, and he went to a place called Machanayim, which is on the other side of the Yarden. There, this fellow by the name of Barzillai from Gilad came together with other individuals, and they provided David and his famished followers with food and supplies. And apparently there were two types of shasisa that they brought for David HaMelech. Dichsiv, as the pasuk tells us in Shmuel Beis, Mishka v'sapos ukli yotzer v'chitin usiorim v'kemach v'koli uful v'adoshim v'kolu. Anyway, you see that there was shasisa that was made of parched chitim and siorim, meaning kernels of grains, and then there was shasisa that was made from the flour of parched lentils. Nowadays, the practice is that when they take out baskets upon baskets, and they've got shasisa, and it's in the market of Narda, less the accepted minhag was like Rav, and with Mekil, and we don't have to worry about confusion with that shasisa that's made with vinegar. Then the Mishnah says that kvasham shedarkam losis tochan, right? Kvashim are like pickled preserves and so forth and so on, and they put wine into it. And obviously, if there's wine and vinegar, you can't eat that because you're buying it from the goyim. Omer Chizkiya, lo shanu el shedarkon. Only in a case where the local custom is to add wine into these preservatives. If we know that in this particular location they don't add any wine. So I'm sorry. If we don't know whether or not they add wine, then it's also b'shtia on the side that they may have had wine, but since it's only a suffix, you're allowed to benefit from it. You're allowed to sell it or feed it to your dog. I will be a dua, but in a case where we know that they put vinegar into these kvashim, into these preserves, then also filbano. Umay shno mi murias tishora bonabano. What about the case of murias? Murias, we said, was a kind of a fish that was mixed with wine. And we said that it's mutabana, even though we definitely know that they mixed wine in it. Or at least most people would add wine to murius. So what's the difference here between kvoshim and murius? And the Gemara answers, Hasam la bure zuama. Why did they add wine to murius? To remove a certain odor. So it wasn't added into the wine was not added into the murius for purpose of enhancing the taste of the murius. Hacha, but here in the case of the preserves, lamatuke taima, they add the wine to enhance the taste, sweeten the taste of the preserves. And therefore, more machmir, we aser even bano. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, afilu biyadua nami mutter. Even if we know for sure that they added wine or vinegar to the preserves, it's still mutter b'hano. And the question is, why is that so? And if we know that they added wine, it should be also aser b'hano. So the Gemara right away raises the objection. Ma'ishno mimurios l'Rabbi Meir de aser b'hano. Right, Rabbi Meir holds that murios is aser b'hano because they added wine, and we pretty much have almost a vadai that they added the wine. That makes it yain nesach aser b'hano. And so too in the case of murios, if you're talking about a case where yadua, and that means that we have every reason to believe they added the wine, then the murios should be aser b'hano. Why does Rabbi Yochanan say it's mutter b'hano? And here we turn to Daf Lamentes. Hasam Yedia Mamoshal. In the case of murios, we know that they added the wine in its mamoshals. Mamoshals means be'en meaning in its essence. But hacha, here in the case of preserves, lo yedia mamoshal. Rabbi Yochanan is going to be mekil because lo yedia mamoshal. The murios, which is used as a kind of a dip, and the wine that was added to the murios is eaten with it, Rabbi Meir holds that even though you don't see the wine, but you know it's there, its essence is present in the food, in the murios, and therefore it's aser b'hano. But in the case of preserves, Rabbi Yochanan claims that the preserved cucumber or whatever it is eaten, but the brine, which is the wine or vinegar that's added, is only there to preserve the vegetable. So therefore, essentially, you don't really eat the wine. It's only there to protect the vegetable. And therefore, Rabbi would agree that in the case of these preserved vegetables, there's only an Iser Achila, no Iser Hano. Now we get to something called Taurus. Taurus, trufa. Trufa means they cut it up into small pieces. And apparently it's some sort of a fish. Vitzir, and they added brine. She'ein ba daga. So the Mishnah says you're not allowed to eat this Taurus trufa if the Mishnah says it has no mixture of kilbis in it. Kilbis is a fish that we said was the same as chilik, meaning it doesn't have skins and scales when it's in the water when it's first born, but later on it develops them, so it's a kosher fish. My chilik, Omer of Nachman bar Abba Rav Zu Sultanis. This is the sultanis fish. So again, it develops its fins and its scales when it matures. Umipnei ma asura, mipnei she'arvona ola ima. There's another fish which is called arvona, which looks very much like the sultanus, but yet it never develops skins, fins, and scales, and therefore it's awesome. It's a treifa fish, but it looks very much similar to the sultanus, and therefore we don't want to mess around with the sultanus because we might come to eat an arbona. Tana Rabbana learned in the Brisa ein lo achshav. Right now, as the fish develops, it doesn't have fins and scales. Be asid legadol achar zman, but it will grow them later on. Kigona sultanis, another fish which is called ha'afitz, harezem mutter. But yeshlo achshav, be asid lahashir b'shosha olam min hamayim. We have a whole bunch of fish that although at the time that they develop, they have skin, scales and fins, but I said scales and fins. Did you hear that? Scales and fins, yeah. Okay. Totally b'das acher. Okay. So these scales and fins will fall away with time. Keep going. And here's a whole list of fish, which I'm not going to even read them. They're in a different language. And that's mutter. That there also, since at the beginning of its development, it had scales and fins, therefore it's mutter. Achris Rabbi Avoda Kisri. So if you're ever on a trip to Caesarea, please remember the announcement of Rabbi Avoda. Rabbi Avoda was the famous Amora from Caesarea, and he announced that Kirvei Dagim the Ubaran Nikachin Mikol Adam. You could buy from anyone, even a guy, or perhaps even a non-religious Jew who's not observant. You could buy fatty innards of fish. Why? Because chezkasan einem boim elami pilusa v'aspamia. Right? The waters that brought these fish to Caesarea came from these places called Pilusa, these rivers. And these rivers, Pilusa and Aspamia, only had kosher fish in them. Now, that seems to be biologically very strange that you had rivers that only had kosher fish. But we'll see about the nature of the kosher fish and the vertebrae of those kosher fish and how they could survive in certain waters that non-kosher fish do not survive. Kihadi Amar Abaye, this reflects the sheet of Abaye, Hai, Sachanta, Dibav Nahara Sharia. Now, this word Sachanta is synonymous with the chilek that we said has no scale, no fins and scales when it's first born and develops them later. And where will you find, says Abaye, this fish called Sachanta? You'll find it in a river, Nara, which is called Debav. So it's Debav River. And this river does not contain any non-kosher fish. So you won't have any confusion here between the chilek or the tzachanta and a non-kosher fish. My timer. Why is it that you don't find in the Bav River any of these non-kosher fish? Ile mishum diradife maya, if it's because of the thrust of the water, the flow, which is a very forceful flow. High dug tame. Even a non-kosher fish, kaven de lesle chuta shidra. Now again, this is very difficult biologically because the Gemara is assuming that non-kosher fish do not have a spine. But apparently what the Gemara has in mind is that it doesn't have the same kind of spine that a kosher fish has. And therefore, it cannot survive the very thrust of the waters of this river called Bav. That's not true. We actually saw that these, spineless non-kosher fish survived in such currents. Ella, we have to offer another possibility. Mishum de maya, it's a salty water. And Haidag Tome, the non-kosher fish, came into Leslie Kalfe. They don't have scales, right? The scales protect the fish. Is beduchta de milchi maya lomotzikoi. They cannot survive a place where the waters are salty. For kazina dekoi, again, the Gemara says it's not true. We have eyewitness testimony to the fact that these non-kosher fish survive even in salty waters. Ella, the Gemara offers now a third possibility. Mishum de lo Marbetina Dagtame. What's unique about the Bav River? Apparently, there's something in the bed of the river that's called a silt, or in Aramaic it's called a tina. And in terms of this river called the Bav River, the silt of the bed of the river does not promote the development of these non-kosher fish, and the same thing applies to pulisa and aspama. So Rabbi Avoda therefore ruled that if you get fish from those areas that are being brought by those rivers, then you could buy it from anybody. There's no concern that the fish are not kosher. Amar Ravina says things have changed. Ha'idna, nowadays, the Koshavchi Bei Nahar Guzo Nahar Gamda, there are other rivers called the Goza River, the Gamda River, that flow into the Bav River, Asire. Then even if you get this kosher fish called a chilek from the Bav River, it's aser, because they might mix in non-kosher fish. So the Bav River is no longer reliable. Amar Abaye, Hai Chamra Diyama Shori. Now, Chazal believe that for every animal that lives on the ground, there is a corresponding fish that looks like, to some extent, that animal. You know, you could have a zebra fish, you could have a donkey fish. And according to Abaye, any fish in the sea that looks like an animal on land is aser. It's a treifa fish. No, I'm sorry, not any fish. But if it's Torah diyama aser, if it looks like an ox, apparently there's a fish that looks like an ox. It's a sea ox. It's a treifa fish, says Abaye. However, even though the animal itself is kosher, the fish that looks like that animal and is named by that animal is not kosher. But you have a non-kosher animal, like a donkey, chamora, and you have apparently a fish that looks like a donkey, and even though the donkey itself is tameh, but the fish is tar. Rav Ashi, and simana tameh, Torah. Rav Ashi says, Shfar Nuna Shore Kidash Nuna Asir. Now, in Italian, there's the word nona, but in Aramaic, there's the word nuna. So let's not confuse the two. A nuna is a kind of a fish, and there are two species of nuna fish. One is called Shfar Nuna, and the other is called Kedesh Nuna. The Kedesh Nuna, like Hegdesh, Lashon Hegdesh, is also, you can't be nene from Hegdesh. Simona Kodesh Lashem. But the Shafar Nona, that is a fish that has scales and fins, and therefore it is a kosher fish. Ika Diamri, according to another version, Kvar Nuna Osur, Simona Kivre Akum. Now, this is a little bit strange. There's another fish, Nuna is a fish, but it's called a Kvar Nuna. And it's Asur. And it's just like Kivrei Akum that are Asur. Now, the truth is that Kivrei Akum are not really Mitame. The Torah created a Tumas mess with regard to a Jewish corpse. So Rabbeinu Chananel has the opposite girsa, that Kvar Nuna is permitted, just like the graves of idolaters are not Mitame. Others want to suggest that we could defend our girsa and say Kivrei Ovdei Kochav means that this kever, meaning this fish, is for the Ovdei Kochav. They're allowed to eat it, we're not. Rabbi Kivekla, he was on his way to a place called Ginzak. They brought him a certain fish that was similar to a non-kosher chipusha fish. So he covered the fish with a basket, and he wanted to see if it's really kosher or not. He did a test. The fish was covered in the basket, started thrashing about. The skin of the fish started rubbing against the sides of the basket, and chaza bei kalfi v'sharya. He saw that there were thin scales on the walls of the basket, and that proved that this fish actually had scales. If it has scales, it has fins by definition, and therefore it's a kosher fish. Rav Asher iklol Tarmudah. He came to a place called Tarduya, and they brought him a fish, and it was similar to an eel. An eel is a non-kosher fish, doesn't have skin, it doesn't have scales or fins. Nakte lahadiyoma, he held it against the sun, and chaza, what did he see? Dahavi beit simche v'sharye. It had scales, so he permitted it. Rav Ashi who asked Rav Ashi came to a certain place, and they brought him a fish that was similar to shvar nuna, that was the nuna fish that was mutter. He wanted to be absolutely sure that it was a kosher fish. He covered it with a white bowl, and chazabe kalfi v'shari. He saw that it had scales, and he permitted it. Rabba bar Chana iklo li'aka diagma. He came to that place, and krivalu tzachanta. Tzachanta, we said, was a kosher fish, like a chilik, because it had scales and fins when it was young. I'm sorry, when it was older. Shame lahu gavra davikori be bote. But even though he thought that this fish was a chilak fish, he heard somebody call it a bate. Bate is a non-kosher fish. Amar Sarab Bar Chana declared, Midaka korile bate, shmamino davar tame isbe. There's something about this fish that's not kosher, even though I know it's a kosher fish. But as he saw it as a simum in a shamayim, that he heard that it's a bate, which is non-kosher fish. Ashkech bei davar tame, and indeed, they discovered that this fish was mixed with other fish, and the other fish went on kosher. Kari Nafshi called himself the pasuk in Mishlei, Lo Ye'unet L'Tzadik Kol Oven HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects the righteous people. Vakoret shel chiltis, a grain of chiltis, is awesome. Why is it awesome? My timer. Mishum de mafseke le b'sakin. They cut it up with a knife. No, now wait a second. We said that nosin tam lefgam is mutter, according to that mandiomer, and the sakin of the guy wasn't used for the last 24 hours. So the Gemara answers, this is called a davar charif, very famous principle, about cutting things like lemons and onions and different kinds of things. It's called ducha de sakina. Agav churpei de chiltisa. This chiltis is very sharp, right? It's like we said before, like a sharp onion or lemon. Is mechal yolei shamnusa. So any fat that comes out, which normally is nosin tam lefgam, it has a negative, detrimental flavor, but here, because of the sharpness of the chiltas, it sweetens it. Therefore, it's as if it gives a good flavor to the mixture and is forbidden. Right, the servant of Levi ordered or sold chiltis, and kinach nafshe de Rabbi Levi, when Rabbi Levi passed away, also lekami de Rabbi Yochanan, and amru le ma'u lizvan mineh. Can I buy from the servant of Rabbi Levi after Rabbi Levi's passing? Can I rely on the fact that it's a kosher fish? Amalahu, Rabbi Yochanan said, Avdu shel chever, you can rely on the eved of a chaver. Chaver is someone who pronounces his commitment to observe the Torah, the mitzvahs, and the eved has the same status as the chaver even after the adon, the master, dies. Of Huna bar Yomi, he bought tcheles from the wife of Rav Amram Chasid. Rav Amram Chasid had passed away, and he left an almana. And there was a whole issue about tcheles, because there was something called kola elon, which looked like tcheles, and the imposters were selling it at the high price of tchelis, but it wasn't really tchelis, and it was possible. And can we believe the almana of Rav Amram Chasida to trust her and rely on her that this is real tchelis? Also, the case came from Yosef. You didn't know what to do, Rav Yosef. Okay, interesting. This man by the name of Hanan was a tailor, and he meets Rav Huna and Amar Le, and he says to him, Yosef, Anya Manale. In other words, you sound like you're poor, Anya, because you don't have an answer to the question. But b'didiavi uvda, I had a case where I bought from the Almana Ravina. Dizvini tchilta me'anshe debeise de Ravana. I bought cheles from the wife of Ravana. The avasoy lekamid of Masla came from Masla havi biode asas lekamid of Yehuda me'agronia, and Amalina falt liyad. Hachi Amar Shmuel, you fell into the right place, right hands, because I could quote to you, transmit to you Shmuel's statement, Eishes Chaver Rei Kechaver. The wife of the Chaver has the same status as the Chaver even after the death of the Chaver, and therefore the wife of Rav Amram Chasida can be trusted that she's selling genuine tchelis. Tana Rabbanan, Eishes Chaver Rei Kechaver. Avto Shel Chaver Rei Kechaver. Chaver shemeis ishto banu v'nei beis areim b'ches kasam. You can rely on them. They'll continue in the legacy of their late father. Achi chashtu, unless we have some reason to suspect them, some story happened, some testimony against the v'chein. Chatzis shemochrim b'ot tcheles. There's a certain courtyard where they sell tcheles, and they're very careful about guaranteeing that tchelis is genuine. Tchelis is harei hi b'ches kasa ad shetipasa. You can always assume that in this courtyard, the tchelis that's being sold there is real bona fide tchelis. And this applies to a courtyard where they're selling tchelis even after the original residents had passed on. If the original residents was still around, then obviously you could rely on them. But the reference here is to a market that was long established as a place that imported and sold only tchelis that was genuine. And therefore, the market retains its reliable status even after such time that you might suspect, well, who knows, in this generation, maybe they're not reliable. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, Eishes Amoritz Shenisis L'Chaver. So this woman in her first marriage was married to an Amoritz who was not careful about the mitzvahs. But now she married a Chaver. Or, alternatively, Bito Shel Amoritz Shenisis L'Chaver, the daughter of Amoritz, she wasn't raised as the daughter of a Talmud Chacham, but she now married a Chaver. In all these cases, they have to stand in front of a bezdin, make a formal declaration that we accept all the rules of chaverus in terms of trumas and maasros, in terms of tcheles, in terms of being believed about fish, that there's no mixture of non-kosher fish, etc., etc. And as a result of the fact that he accepted the rules of the game, they have a cheskas, they have the status of chaverim, and we can trust them. She originally, in her first marriage, was married to a chaver who's reliable on all these kashrus issues. But now, after that marriage terminated, she marries now an amoritz. Or bito shel chaver shenisis amoritz, she's now married to an amoritz. Avdo shel chaver nimkal amoritz. Einon tzrichen lekabel divrei chaveres lechatchila divrei meir. But Meir says a pella of a chidush. We don't need them to accept chaverus. Why? Because they carry on the tradition from their first husband, and in the case of an Eved, from his original master, and that was the tradition of chaverus. So there's no need for some sort of formal acceptance of the rules of Chaveris. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afheim Tzrichim Lekabel Divrei Chaveris L'Chatchila. V'chein Hoy Rabbi Shimon Elazar, Ma'aser Isha Sunisis Lechaver, V'hoisa Kosheres Lo Tfilin Al Yodo, but Nises Lo Moches, Hoisa Kosheres Lo Kishrei Moches Al Yod. Wow. So this woman in her first marriage was married to a Chaver, and now she got used to putting tefillin on her first husband. That's how reliable she is. But now, another case of a woman who was married to a chaver, now she gets married to a moches. The moches were the evil tax collectors. They used to, what's the word I want to use here? Just give me a second. Extortion, that's the word. I probably haven't heard that word in 50 years. So these tax collectors would extort money from the Jews. And even though they were Jews themselves. So, for example, they would say that the king gave us the rights to pocket the money of the taxes, and they would raise the taxes and pocket the money, claiming that the king had raised the taxes. And as a result of the fact that in her second marriage, she was married to one of these mochsin, she's no longer reliable. The influence of her second husband is that much more powerful than that of her first husband. She adopts the sinful behavior of her second husband. Accordingly, we must be concerned that a woman who is married to a chaver then gets married to a ma'oretz has adopted the less scrupulous practices of her second husband. She'll have to reaffirm her commitment to the rules of chaverus, etc. Omar Rav. Okay, here we have Rashi Tevis. Avis asur b'chosam echad b'chamfag mutter b'chosam echad. So there's a list of 4 things here called chavis that all require what's called a double chosem. In other words, when you get it from a guy, it's not enough that there's 1 seal, you need 2 seals. Some say because these are doraisa, and therefore you have to be more machmir. Okay. So what are they? What is the ches, beis, yud, taf? Ches is for chalav, when you buy chalav from the guy. Basar, the beis. Yayin, the yud. And cheles is the taf. However, now we have a different category where 1 chosem is sufficient, and that's called champad. So cholav basar yayin cheles, that requires 2 chosem. Second, where am I? There's a chosem on top of a chosem. But asurim b'chosem echad. They only have 1 chosem, then they're asur.